expanding your for 1, 2, 3, 4, and slowly breathe out. Let's take a deep breath in again. Expand your belly. 1, 2, 3, 4, and on the out breath, sigh out with mouth opened, letting out any tension and anxiety in your body at this moment. And say to yourself, I'm safe within my essence. And say with me, I am enough. I am worthy. I have what it takes to navigate life because I am possible. I'm capable. I'm loved. I'm supported. And I am sacred. With that, give yourself a soothing hug, kisses, and in any part of your body that you feel like connecting with in this moment, and if you feel like kisses and a lot of love and hug towards you and for yourself. And now stretch out and interlock your hands across above your head. And slowly take a deep breath in and move to the right, slowly bending to the right. Breathe out, come back to the center. Take a deep breath in, slowly to the left. Slowly breathe out, come back to the center and shake out everything that you need to let go at this point in time. I know that this exercise has taken part of my time, but I think it's very important to center ourselves, to ground ourselves, and to connect with who we are. Because what I even want to do is begin this conversation asking a question as we reimagine well-being beyond productivity, exhaustion, and survival. And my question to us is, what happens inside of us to our minds, bodies, and art when we are taught that our value is tied primarily to how much we can work, produce, endure, survive, or sacrifice? What happens inside of us? Do we thrive or do we merely strive, striving to survive? I think this is important because for many of us across post-colonial Africa, labor has never simply been about employment or social mobility. Labor has often been about survival, as obligation, as extraction of dignity from our bodies and lives. It's about unpaid care, sacrifice, and leading to deep exhaustion. And increasingly, labor has become the organizing principle around which life itself revolves, especially through an extractive capitalist and patriarchal culture that has remained tenacious and unyielding. Because, this has really remained unyielding. It just began to repackage itself. And what we are left with is chronic burnout, emotional depletion, digital overwhelmness, financial strain, mental, spiritual, and physical fatigue. I know at least that in many feminist spaces, and this is why we're here today, and thanks to Now We Collective for starting this conversation, we've increasingly become aware that these extractivist economics are unsustainable for our bodies, minds, and lives. I'm sure many of you will agree with me in this room. So my offering sits within this space today of reflecting together on what it might mean to imagine labor otherwise. How will it work for us beyond constant productivity, beyond survival, and towards restoration, reciprocity, and collective well-being? So I've decided to bring my conversation in two parts. I want the first to be around unpacking and talking briefly about the inheritance of survival and unjust systems that is driving what is unsustainable for our minds, bodies, and art. And the second would be around imagining otherwise. And I'm just going to share some insights and leave us with some questions to begin to process how we want to go. So moving on, the inheritance of survival and unjust systems. I think many of us imagined that this digital age would make life easier, especially with COVID-19, working from home, that we would rest better, work with more joy, and worry less about survival. But is that what's happening? Anyone? Anyone? Exactly. You can give me a thumbs up to indicate that, this is landing somewhere. And instead, what we continue to carry is the existing labor cultures that never center renewal, community, inclusion, or collective well-being. That has gone now into digital spaces because it's about the culture that we're carrying about, the culture of anti-gender politics, extractivist economics, exploitative system, and it's now so rebranded and deeply embedded in the digital age. So I recall the polyvocal conversation I contributed to, titled Pan-African Feminist Labor Narratives, Pan-African Feminist Labor Narratives, working, imagining, and building otherwise. I think this is part of why we continue this conversation. It was written by our amazing Juanita, and thank you for that, and thank you for Nawi Collective for continuing this conversation. Within that conversation, I reflected on how my childhood was shaped by the understanding of work and what, in line with heteropatriarchal capitalism and post-colonial extraction of what life should be about. It's about wearing, strength and survival as badge of honor. And this is being carried to, the adulthood that continuously want to find ways to survive. Those upbringing that will program in you that sacrificing and being in service for others is what you are here for, especially if you are a girl child. So you are resting, it's like, what are you doing? You are doing nothing. Shouldn't you be busy somewhere, And at the end of the day, we grow up inheriting cultures of ableism, gendered hierarchies, urgency culture, and the extraction of emotional, physical, and mental labor, especially of women and marginalized people. Some of what I'm saying might, sound familiar to some of you because this system have fundamentally make us continue to use our bodies, relationships, community, and environment and as site of exploitation, as site of extraction, as something that we need to give to society, as something that's supposed to be, pillaged. All of that is part of why the consequence, remember the question I asked you, what happens inside of us, within us, is that now psychosomatic consequences of this system. And some of them are so invisible. You just realize that you carry now stress, fear, you carry within your system awareness, and you still keep on going, because that's what we're supposed to do, isn't it? So what's so unfortunate as well is we're not in this culture with digital age, where data extraction, endless notification, performance metrics, algorithm visibility, digital surveillance, and attention commodification have now become the thing that we are now grappling with. So digital capitalism, if you will. And this has now further collapsed the boundaries between labor and life. And I must confess here, I take my phone to bed. Sometimes I tell myself, no, do that, just put it elsewhere in some other room and in the morning you go back and get it. But no, I'm like, that last information, that last message, that person you've not written to today. And by the time I'm doing that, I have started scrolling other things. I could recall something happening in Nigeria one time, and I was about to go to sleep at 2 a.m. Mark you, I'm navigating menopause. And sometimes my sleep is just so bad. I'm already, and I am already a conditioned night owl. So I was going to bed and somebody sent me something shocking at 2 a.m. in the morning. I did not sleep till 5 a.m. because I couldn't switch off. I started scrolling to look for the information to see what's going on, what has gone viral. So, and again, if you look at the rise of AI and automation, it's now increasingly encouraging us to value efficiency over humanity. And at what cost? At the cost of care, slowness, creativity, healing, spirituality, community. It's at that cost. Somebody said something recently at a global healing justice forum I attended in Kenya, Adenti. They said anyone who benefits from a system that is not working never sees the problem. And I reflected on that. I was like, whoa. So because the privilege that people have is why we're where we are, thinking money accumulation is the way to go. But mark you, if you look at this culture itself, it does not protect the people who are benefiting from the devastating effects of the system that we need to interrogate and dismantle. Isn't that the truth? And what I want to bring to our attention, especially when it comes to what we have lost, and please, you can add more into the chat room as I mentioned them. First is connection, our connection to ourselves, to earth, to each other. We have lost reciprocity. We have lost mutual care. We have lost collective joy. And we have lost the capacity to thrive together because we are just on the rush, not slowing down, you know. And within this space of the forum, Healing Justice Forum I talked about, I was to support people with healing, healing presence. And the other facilitator with me came to my room the night that I arrived, and she had helped me with something. So in order not to delay her, I was rushing around, running in the room. She was standing there. She didn't tell me she was in a hurry, but like the urgency in my head that I'm keeping somebody waiting, I just started dashing around the room. She was like, "Can you stop running?" And in my head, it hits me that this is what we do now. Not slowing down, losing connection, all of these things is part of what this culture of inheritance survivor has done to us. I'm still reading the room to see if there's anything that come up for you that you want to contribute to this conversation. And going forward, I would love to bring what I am benefiting from as I'm processing how to slow down, how to reconnect with nature, with life, and how to dismantle within my own space this culture that is not sustainable. Is the work of the late ecofeminist, Professor Wangari Maathai, The Challenge for Africa. Some of you might have read it, and if not, I'm recommending. She reminds us of the indigenous African understanding where our relationship to land, water, community, and ourselves was sacred. We've lost that to this urgency culture. We no longer wait to connect. We now live within a nervous system that carries fear, survival, precarity, scarcity, and constant unrest. So let me quickly just move to part 2 with what I've said that I'm sure is not new to many of us, but I think it's just important to touch on that. I will move now into imagining otherwise. And I believe that many previous speakers and contributors in the previous conversation have spoken brilliantly about the realities shaping feminist labor futures in this age of polycrisis. And I've also reminded us somewhat what survivor inheritance does to us. And I would now like for us to look into what life would look like. Just imagine it with me, where productivity is no longer what we see as our worth. Also, culture is not our identity. Burnout is not one as a badge of honor. Can you visualize? Do you see yourself running around in some garden and just laughing, giggling, smiling, eating fruit, dropping mangoes from the tree? What's that? And I know, even in my own environment, they've butchered our forest. So I'm only sitting in the daydreaming imagination. But let's keep on imagining this together, where grind culture is not taking over our lives, and where we are not using exhaustion as a proof of our deservingness. So where that sits for me is a return to African feminist understanding of Ubuntu, our interdependence, our interconnectedness, and the way we collectively reciprocate care. I was sharing this example somewhere recently where I recognized that in Yoruba culture, when we greet each other, not today, where it's like, hey, hi, we even greet in English and people, before they reply, you've moved on. Somebody is greeting you. They are checking on your family, your pets, your chair and table. They make it a conversation. They're not going anywhere. How are you? How is this? And that's the space of remedy. If something is happening to you, you mention it. They're like, oh, I have a remedy for that. And then they exchange collective well-being just by greeting one another. So returning to these indigenous African cultures and systems are very important for us to be able to reimagine labor as relational and as communal, as opposed to this individualized productivity that we've inherited. So I want us to reconnect to a place where giving, receiving, caring, resting, and living together is so affirming. And I know that we can't do it in isolation. It has to be done together. And this is where Afrofeminism is telling us that healing justice is a framework that could help us reconnect back to ourselves. And this is inviting us to do Pan-Africanism differently. So I know I have like 2 minutes more, and I will quickly say we need to continue to honor some of these practices in the way we begin to organize, to move, in the way we build our own system at home and even in our organizations. It means that we have to cultivate power with as a labor process together, not power over that is common, power with. And this we have to do without waiting for the oppressive system to do it for us, unfortunately. Because we need to continue to give the middle finger to that oppressive system, that unjust system, by the way we are organizing. And so I want to say that I genuinely believe that we need to reset by going back to labor that values community, ecology, care, reciprocity, joy, love, resting rituals, and collective thriving. And to do that, I want to mention 4 things that I think is important for us to look at. We need to begin to imagine future where care is infrastructure. It's not an add-on. It's infrastructure in everything we do. Rest has to be recognized as a political thing to do, and well-being as collective. And labor becomes restorative in this sense. I know that I may not be breaking it down in a way that speaks to what to do specifically, one-on-one. But I want to talk about what I've begun to do in my own space. Like the person who worked with me, not for me, with me as my domestic staff. The way we treat each other and we reciprocate care are led to her recognizing that some places are not meant for her to work, where she's exhausted, shouted at, not even paid for her labor. So that is giving her another way of showing up in our agency. And this part of what we can begin to do to dismantle this unjust system by the way we show up, by the way we tend to how this unsustainability feels in our body and heart. And lastly, 3 questions before I go that I want us to kind of please reflect on. The first is, how do we make work restorative in this age of polycrisis? Begin from yourself, from your home, from your community, and from your organization. The second is, how do we make care, labor, and living reciprocal? How do we turn this to reciprocal acts for ourselves, where not just one person is benefiting and the other person is getting exhausted? And the last is, how do we make rest, joy, and slowing down non-negotiable as a political act? I really want us to reflect on these questions as we begin to think through how to show up for one another, how to begin to program ourselves otherwise, and how we begin to tend to our nervous system. Begin even by resting today. And that's important. And I'm going to do the same for myself. Thank you for coming to my Ubuntu Healing Circles. I have a few books to share, but I will get to that later. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Toyin. A lot to reflect on at a personal level, but also as the collective. Some of what you shared reminded me, I think last year, I started struggling with, like, my feet whenever I would sit would start swelling. And, that's because you sit at your desk for long hours. And so I guess my body had just started showing me that, yeah, this is not sustainable. And so one of the things that I was recommended to do was to literally touch grass. So go out and have my feet in like soil and things like that. But because of the way that life is set up, you live in these concrete jungles.
Yes.
I actually found it difficult to find dirt, like literal dirt and grass. And so I'd have to walk outside my house for a period of time before then I could find grass to, yeah, literally just stand in. So it's really important for us to reflect on these things, because then there are actually consequences to our bodies and to our lives. And I was having a conversation with someone yesterday on this call, and I was encouraging them to take leave and to take rest. And they were asking, what will they do? What
Yes.
will they do? So when you talked about, um, I guess the badge of burnout being like a badge of honor, and us thinking that if you're not working or if you're not like constantly on, then what else is there to
Yes.
life? But I think
Yes.
it's important for us to think beyond the life and the way the world has made us believe that life is supposed to be. So
Yes.
yeah, let me not
Thank you.
preempt some of that.
Before you call the next speaker, please give me just a minute.
Yes, please.
I love the example you've shared because that caught to mind a Kenya brother that I spoke to. I think this was in 2011. I started meditating, taking moment to process my emotion and things that I was going through as at the time. So I was telling him about meditation and the need to just sit things out and do nothing. So he told me, what you want me to just sit doing nothing? That's laziness. So he started just like, no, this is not working, but I'm going somewhere. Then he started meditating. He joined the meditation program that I was on. And later he went to Thailand or somewhere to meditate in the with some monks for like 1 month. And he even wrote a book about slowing down. So that's where, yeah, he wrote a book about slowing down, how to program life better and not constantly stress. And where that lands for me is that when you are able to sit Utilize tools that are holistic to process where you are. It gives you insight and clarity to do life differently. It's just being able to take that on, find that moment, and then to see that some of the things we do or say yes to, we can say no. And some of things that we say yes to, we say no to for our own self within our own art and life, we can say yes to. I can say yes to sleeping. I can say yes to, not sacrificing for people who don't value me or give back and, nurture me back. So these are the ways we can begin to concretize and practicalize the change that we are reimagining. All right, see.
Thank you so much, Dr. Toyin. And there's no one who has taught me to say no more than the next speaker, who is Twasima. And yes, like I mentioned at the start, Twasima runs with the gospel of freedom. And so Twasima is going to, I guess, help us explore what freedom looks like beyond work, in the ways that we have come to know it, but also what it might mean to live without the constant pressure to produce. And yeah, over to you, Twasima.
Thanks, Joey. Okay. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining and for the gift of your presence and time. And thank you to Dr. Toyin for setting us off so brilliantly. I was just like, yeah, the whole time, because everything that you say, I resonate so deeply with. Okay, so when the brilliant team at NAWI reached out and asked me to prepare for this presentation, they said that they wanted me to share reflections meant to explore what freedom looks like beyond access to work and what it might mean to live without the constant pressure to produce. Now, because I am a storyteller, I will do this by sharing some stories with you. The first is that in 2020, COVID happened. And for me, like you, the world stopped entirely. Perhaps for the first time in our lifetime, like that, the world actually stopped. And for me, something shifted in the quiet of that still world. In the midst of all of us suddenly forced silent by lockdowns and the jarring reminder of just how precarious our modern life is, I began to come to the deep realizations of how unsustainable my working practices were. And I began to ask myself questions that I'd never asked myself. Like, is this really what life is? And what would it mean if I lived a life where money was not the sole reason I was doing something? I asked myself what survival looks like in a world that is as fragile as COVID taught us. I asked myself, what would I be doing if I was not working for money? I thought about how I would reshape my relationship with money. I thought about titles. I'd spent over a decade building a career, all of which just seemed inconsequential in the general scheme of things. Now, it felt that collectively, all of us were having the same kind of awakening. And it looked like we would be able to once again reimagine the world. And that out of the very catastrophic and jarring experience that we had collectively had, that was COVID-19, that we would reimagine the world because we had been forced still and shown so clearly how the world was not working. But as we know, all of that was so short-lived. instead of reimagining the world, we were told that we should be aspiring to a return to the normal. And yet, perhaps in spite of all our legislating, all our resistances, all our communing and building movements, normal was not working for us. And yet, in spite of still, that which oppresses us is unending. And so even after COVID and what we experienced, the wars have never ended, from Palestine to Congo to Sudan to Iran to West Africa. The war machine is endless. And then there are attacks on the earth. Water is scarce. The earth is dry. Food is no longer food in so many ways. All of that with the now proliferation of AI and technologies that are owned by big capital and a few tech bros who have continually shown their disdain for our humanity. There's so much. But for me, after COVID, I could not go back. I quit my job, my 9 to 5, and decided that I was going to write and that I was going to give myself space to explore what else I could be outside the enslavement of 9 to 5, of existing within institutions that did not make sense to me anymore. So I have been daydreaming and reimagining, and I have been asking myself questions about where we are today and where we have been and where we are going. Along the way, I've come to certain realizations that I share with you now. One of those is that it comes to me that in order to shape the future and understand the present, we must understand first the past. We must look back and understand what has happened to us, to understand where we are and why we are where we are, in order to reimagine new things for ourselves. I believe that doing so also gives us the kind of continuity and connectedness to understand that which we struggle against. It gives us the name, it gives us the language, it gives us the understanding in our bodies, in our memories of that which we have long resisted. Okay, so in understanding labor and work and value, let us look a little bit back to what has led us to be where we are today. Now, by the 19th century, European powers were seeking to entrench their influence and dominance over Africa. All of us know what colonialism is. We understand that Europe at the time was going through an industrial revolution and was needing to justify the growing contradictions within their own capitalist nations that were in dire need of cheap raw materials, labor and markets, especially after the collapse of the transatlantic slave trade, which had been the fuel for Western economies and colonial empires. All of this need to expand, this need to control, this need to take over territories and people that were not theirs, culminated ultimately into the scramble and partition of Africa and all the other things that we know as colonialism. Now, it's important to understand this as the beginning framework for a new kind of modern economic world order that continues to dictate how trade, labor movements, our relationship with the earth operate. Okay, so colonialism ends, but the formal end of that colonial world order does not then put an end to the complex web of power that has resulted as a result. So this is where we understand the term coloniality, which refers to the continued existence of these colonial forms of rationality that reject all other form of value, knowledge, and being, and deem them as irrational, deviant, and uncivilized. So this is where our own African understandings of life and time and being are othered. And we must then also recognize the ways in which we ourselves have become co-conspirators in this rational but rather colonial understanding of the world, and the ways in which on a day-to-day we can then resist it. So as we know, the colonial understanding of work, labor, value has greatly commercialized agriculture and thus violently altered the relationship we have with the land, with food. It has, added to the colonial machinery obligations such as paying tax, and then our complex relationship with the state and with the state, with the wider geopolitical order. Land, which, previously mostly communal, now resides in the hands of a few landlords who continue to extract taxes in order to produce, in order to demand for us currency. And all of this continues to distort our relationship with our material conditions of our life. Of course, this colonial labor sociality has also structured the work of care and social reproduction carried out primarily by women as not quite as valuable and not quite as worthy of fair compensation. It has sold us these ideas of productivity in which the work day is structured the way it is. It has formulated a hierarchy of wages based on arbitrary power relations and concepts that are so vague, such as market value rates, and so on and so on and so on. As a result of this, we continue to deny the value of other forms of work, labor, and practices commonly pursued by non-white people, that which we deem indigenous knowledge, indigenous ways of being. We continuously deny the value of the work of the artists and the artisans, pushing for more STEM, less humanities. There's just constant examples of the ways in which this very violent, racial, and colonial capitalist machineries continues to separate that which actually generates and expands life and that which just generates and expands capital and big value for big profits. Okay, so that is how we have arrived at this point. Now that we are here, right here in the present, then what? So because we now understand coloniality as an extension beyond just an economic model, to include a way of civilizing the world, to include a way of framing what it means to be human, it means that within our movements, we have the responsibility of being cautious of the ways in which that same framework seeps into our own psyche. That means that the work we must do is work that demands of us to rethink our own biases in how we have come to define knowledge, in how we understand time, reality, in who is deemed valuable and why. That means that we must continue to challenge the ways of thinking and being that root us in extractive practices, that continue to plague us into systemic inequalities, that convince us that the ways out of these failings of the world, of the modern world, is through isolation, is through putting profit over all else, is through strapping ourselves to ways of working that leave us fatigued, unimaginative, and in constant conflict with the earth and each other. Okay, so we ask ourselves, if not this, then what? Then what, right? We must make space for the liminal place in which we do not know, in which we are asking, trying, and reimagining. There are no neat answers. And the work of our movements is to allow for that space to exist where we do not have these neat answers, where we are asking questions and holding space for what comes through and what comes next. None of us quite know, and that is also okay. So we're holding space for something else to exist. And as so doing, we're thinking about where these freedoms may be already happening. Some of the obvious examples are there are people whom we have ourselves othered, the people in the rural countryside, the people in indigenous communities, the people who have long sustained a relationship with the earth. But we must also, as African people, as brown people, as people who are oppressed, we must also allow ourselves to seek the wisdoms of those who have lived long before us. Like I said, there are no simple solutions, but there could be some guiding ethos. And like Dr. Toyin, I believe deeply in Ubuntu as a guiding ethos. So let's talk a little bit about what Ubuntu means to me. So I think that Ubuntu is many things, but one of those many is the rootedness in the appreciation that we are all a part of something bigger than ourselves, that we are all interconnected and continually flowing. It is Panashe Chigumazi who says, a person is a person through those who have come before us, those who come with us, and those who come after us. So if we center this knowing, what does that then mean? If we know that we have not made ourselves, we are able to then hold in our bodies possibilities that are vessels tethering us across many different realms and many different timelines. Doing this necessitates that we collapse almost entirely concepts such as time, concepts such as reality, concepts that have been constantly fed back to us by the colonial machinery that has destroyed our histories and made it as though we begin with when they invade and take from us. That has made it as though nothing else existed beyond just this. Doing this opens up an avalanche of memories that are available to us. It opens up new sets of ways in which we remember history, in which the past is accepted. It creates pathways for how the future can be reshaped. In order to do this, we must also constantly challenge things that we have ourselves deemed just the way things are. Concepts of time, for example. We can reject the idea that mercantile time is the only one which generates value. Our relationship with time and the earth can be different. We do not always have to be rushing. We do not always have to fill every single space of the day with something. we have to appreciate that value cannot be captured by just the working hours mindset. That there is so much more to being human that is not in constant creation for the capitalist machine. Now, under Ubuntu, and in the process of reimagining the world, we must also center African restorative justice and jurisprudence that centers reparations as the actual atonement in our material world that we must insist on. Because we recognize that there is a system at play that demands for us to constantly be enslaved in this way. And to reimagine the world with Ubuntu as a guiding ethos is to demand for the world as it exists now to no longer exist. Because of course, that is what reparation means. Constantly, we must also ask ourselves what it means to remain and stay human in a world where our humanity is constantly being stripped away from us. In this age where we are told AI is inevitable, that the future has already been shaped by corporations and a few tech bros, that there is no way to heal the earth, that we must be in this constant war. In that space where our humanity is constantly being stripped away from us, we must ask ourselves what it means to remain human, what it means to remain tethered to this idea that we are vessels, to this idea that we are custodians of the present for those who come after us. We must ask ourselves what it means to undo the material world with all the institutions that hold it hostage. What it means to dream something entirely new. We cannot possibly have all the answers in this moment, but we must constantly do the work to dream, to think, to commune. All right, that's it. Thank you so much for having me and for listening.
Jasima, I think you can see from the reactions. I feel like I was in a trance. But thank you so much for grounding us in our past, our present, our realities, and opening our minds to how we should think around the questions that we have been asking ourselves for so long, questions around freedom and what it means to be human in this moment, but also, in the moments that have come before us. And I think you've really pushed us to reflect on what kinds of life we actually want at a personal level and how to think about work more than, your next paycheck or a better job. And what really the powers that be are taking from us and how we should constantly recognize and be aware of that. And I know there's going to be a lot of discussion and feedback in the plenary. So I will let Selam come in now on questions around AI and technology. You've had Twasima asking questions about what it means to be human and how technology is really taking our humanity away from us and how we relate and see ourselves as human or chatbots or machines. And so how even when we hear narratives around AI replacing labor or people losing their jobs, how true is this in practice? And what kinds of work and labor remain invisible in conversations around tech, future of work, but also what it means for people's identity that has been tied a lot to their work and how much they can produce when things like AI and digital systems are being framed around, or, we won't need these workers anymore, or we won't need these kinds of people anymore. So, yeah, over to you, Selah.
Thank you so much for the question. Before I respond, I want to thank Dr. Toyin first for the stretch, because I had been sitting for quite a few hours and I needed it. And also Twasima for the story, because I think storytellers and artists among us are the ones that are actually helping us think through these supposedly like abstract things such as artificial intelligence or technology or digital spaces thoughtfully, because it helps kind of connect it to narratives of who we are, who we want to be, and the kind of futures that we aspire towards and imagine. So perhaps I can start with what the dominant conversations about AI and labor are. So a lot of the mainstream conversations about AI and work are about kind of the fear of losing jobs, being laid off, and how different organizations and companies are outsourcing work that can be done by machines. And this is not to say that this is not happening. I think there are mass layoffs at multinational technology companies. There's a lot of kind of the knowledge and tech economy shifting that we are seeing, but that is a very specific kind of part of the industry's economy, and it's concentrated in the global minority, or the global north, as they call it. But I mean, these are very real risks, but how we're narrating these problems needs a bit of a shift. So when we talk about labor and how we frame these issues, maybe we need to rethink. So hopefully my reflection will help kind of think about labor and AI beyond these dominant narratives that many people have already written and talked about. So the first thing is that a lot of the labor that's seemingly outsourced to these tools is actually being absorbed by others. So there's a lot of data workers that are continuously training these systems to do these roles for us. So this is not just the initial training for creating these AI tools, but also the continuous training that is required to keep them, quote unquote, efficient and to catch up with the speed at which we are now demanding technology to assist us. And we need to question this ease that is being presented to us as these tools and systems that can help us execute tasks independently, and maybe think about who is working behind these systems, serving as like teachers for these tools to quote unquote learn, or as filters so that we don't experience harmful content on the internet, to think about who is behind these systems to create this illusion of ease and to this illusion of making work, quote unquote, easier. And I think it's also really important to know that the marketing of these tools, particularly generative tools, is dependent on keeping these forms of labor invisible. There's a reason why it's presented as if kind of it's a magic wand that we wave around and it does our work for us, is because the invisibility is what it relies on in order to kind of continue to proliferate into different forms of our work, our lives, and our livelihoods as a whole. So I think we should start by asking, what is enabling these systems to function? Who's involved in this process? And we need to focus on unveiling the amount of labor that this perceived ease we experience is, what's behind it, and how this kind of labor is also unstable. It's often precarious, and sometimes it's also hazardous, both to the mental well-being and also the physical well-being at times of other folks that we do not see and are kept invisibilized behind this work. And the other thing is also there's work that is not branded as data work or AI related work, but that is required in order for these systems to function. So the first one is how it's the materiality of these things. So there's chips, there's wires, there's like actual physical manifestations of these digital tools, and that requires minerals that these chips require. So whose land is being mined for these minerals, who is participating in these mining processes, and who's actually being compensated for these processes, right? So when we think about what AI and work look like, I think there's a lot of different other economies that are related to this and that these tools depend upon that are not always seen as the digital work because they are seen as kind of tangential to it, even though AI depends on it. And the pressure and the stress that those working, whether it's in mining industries or data work, are subjected to is not also confined to their workplace, right? So folks who work as data labelers, as content moderators, or as folks who are mining for critical or rare earth minerals also exist within our communities, right? So their interpersonal relationships are affected. And there's stories coming out of from the Silicon Valley to those who are engaged in data work of partners who are kind of bearing the emotional labor of their partners' work in data work. So there was an article from, I think, The Atlantic that was about the wives of the men who are in the manosphere of Silicon Valley and how they're just having to do so much extra care labor in the household, and also just the emotional labor of being partnered with someone who's obsessed with being part of this tech revolution. And then there's also kind of testimonies from data workers in Africa and the global majority as a whole, where they have fallen into substance abuse. They have resorted to kind of unhealthy means of dealing with the emotional stress that comes with data work. So there's also the additional kind of layer of non-disclosure agreements, which kind of isolates people from seeking support in their communities. So what happens when the emotional stress of this immense labor is not something that folks are allowed to talk about? So people kind of fall between the seams of kind of a tattered social fabric because these digital systems isolate us from the people that we rely on, the communities we rely on, and also subject us to immense amount of stress if we're engaged in them actively. And I think the other thing that we don't think of as work or labor is knowledge and data production as labor. So what I mean by this is how our knowledge, our lived experiences, or even our embodied experiences are now kind of datafied for profit-making purposes, not because we have explicitly consented to them, but because that's how these systems work. So the writing that we have spent so much time learning, the art that we've created, or the advice we've shared on a digital platform at some point is what's being used to develop the intelligent system or the insightful or supportive system or the creative system is the work that we have done over time that has been datafied and fed, quote unquote, into these systems to train them. So how is that not labor? How is, even if we're not being compensated for it, it should be counted at because it does lead to the production of different tools and systems, right? So I think the knowledge part is a little bit more obvious because we're seeing a lot of cases about intellectual property, etc. But I think our embodied experiences are also now being turned into labor, whether we consent to it or not. So with the proliferation of surveillance systems, for example. So the street that we learned to navigate our whole lives and kind of, that is being used as data to train mapping systems, for example. Our facial recognition systems are also kind of the features and the heritage that we have inherited over time throughout generations is now a data point to train a quote unquote intelligent system. So it's not only about how we think of how work is changing in our quote unquote workplaces, but it's also about how our liminal spaces, so the spaces between work and home, our places of leisure, our places of play, and even our homes are sites of surveillance and sites of production because our lives have been commodified and living has become labor, right? And we are producing data all the time. So we're working all the time. And we're not being compensated for it by any means, nor are we being kept safe in these spaces. So I think when we think about the future, perhaps we can think about which parts of our lives do we not want to be datafied or monetized, and which ones do we want to be exempt from it, right? So which parts of our lives do we not want to be part of labor, or at least labor for others? And the second is for the parts of our lives that we are willing to have digitally mediated or to contribute to the digital economy, how do we seek meaningful participation? What does it mean to ask for meaningful consent? And because we are now data producers and also proxy AI system trainers, because the algorithms learn from us, what does meaningful compensation look like beyond the monetary compensation? So I think a couple of things that I noted down as potentials for the future could be, what does community ownership of platforms look like? What does meaningful say over the decisions that these platforms make look like? And also demanding the right to transparency as to how our data is used, how these companies' labor practices, like being entitled to knowing how these tools are created, and also to have the right to demand a positive experience on the platforms if we choose to engage with them. So if we're the ones who are training it through our data and the algorithm depends on us, then how can we not ask for at least a safe and positive experience on those platforms, particularly for those whose identities are marginalized or made vulnerable by these systems? So I think the questions that were raised about what is humanity and who gets to define it are kind of central to this, right? So I think a lot of this is a continuation of how we define ourselves in relation to the work that we do or the places we're employed at. I think that's what this is magnifying. So the way that we define ourselves in relation to our workplaces, then now AI is pulling on that thread and redefining kind of digital humanity for us, because we've already defined ourselves as workers. Now we are being defined as digital workers or digital laborers. So maybe we need to think about what does it mean to be human, both in relation to our work, but also outside of it. So in relation to our loved ones, in relation to ourselves, our communities. So how do we think of ourselves as a collective, not just as a labor force, but as kind of a collective that exists within, but also outside of our relationship with work? And this can kind of hopefully open up what creating technology outside of speed, efficiency, etc. look like, and what does technology that makes our lives better and more enjoyable look like. And this is not to say that tools that make tasks easier are mutually exclusive from a better life, but I think a good life should be beyond wealth accumulation and kind of efficiency for the economic system, but also what does a healthy, fulfilling, enjoyable life for all of us together look like instead of a select few. And I think for the final contribution I want to make before recommending a book, which Joanita knows I'm known for, I think I'll propose kind of a provocation to say that maybe when we think of technology as something that offers us high efficiency and productivity, we rob ourselves of what technology can mean for the future. So there are multiple futures that can exist, and it is kind of our collective responsibility, but our collective privilege that we get to create that. So the thing that makes humanity sacred is we come from a long history of those who lived and worked together before us. And we also have the collective responsibility to think and dream of a future we do not see for those we do not see and have not walked this earth yet, right? But when we have predictive systems that decide what the future looks like and generative systems that hijack our language with which we speak these futures and we realize these futures, we give up our futures to machines. So in order to not do that, when I saw the title for this session, I remembered a book that genuinely changed my life. It's called, wait, let me remove my blur. It's called Experiments in Imagining Otherwise by Lola Olufemi. There we go. So it has a lot of like provocations. I'll paste the link for it as well. It's essentially kind of provocations to think about a future otherwise. So they start with a provocation to saying that when we connect A to B, if we think of a straight line, how do we really think about history? And we can still connect it with a circle. And what does that tell us about how we think? And it has a lot of different invitations to think of a feminist future, a collective future with shared responsibility. So I'll share the link in the chat if folks have access. If you're in Ethiopia, I can lend you one with many marginalia of myself and my loved ones. But yeah, I'll paste the chat in the meantime and pass it back to you, Janita.
Thank you so much, Selam. I was reading Anuli's, I hope it's Anuli, where they say reimagining in itself can be laborious. And I feel like my head, with all the information that I've received, there's so much to think about on a personal level, but in terms of my feminist practice, as a collective, and now still you've added thinking about the people in the future and how they will experience the world as it is. So, yeah. But thank you so much to all the speakers. I see a number of threads coming out in all that you have shared, and I do not want to take time away from people who would want to share or ask or share their reflections. So I'll open up the floor before I can also share a few thoughts. So if anyone would like to say something, please raise your hand. Or you can also put it in the chat. I've seen a lot of conversation happening in the chat, so. Yes, Komugar, please go ahead.
Thank you to all the speakers. It was a really lovely conversation, especially on race, as mediated by Dr. Toyin and Twasima. However, for me, rest is really a contentious topic for me, especially when Twasima gave an example of the pandemic and how it almost was like a provocateur for us to reimagine, our lives without work. And I think for me, that trigger was that for the global majority, at least where I stay in Uganda, is that I cannot speak of rest without evoking the economy and the politics around it. Because to many of us during COVID, while a lot of people had the opportunity to slow down, to rest, there was a huge segment, by the way, of people who didn't, for whom that was a luxury, right? For home rest was even unfathomable. We literally panicked when the economy stopped because we knew the consequences were dire for us. So it was just we were and the fact that we were abandoned both collectively, socially, and politically by our government, the people, every single person. So for me, when I hear conversations about stress, they do not evoke any, I don't know how to even say it. I literally just go numb, right? I just go numb because I remember that time when a lot of us, when it was happening, everyone was saying, yes, this is an opportunity to slow down, and the rest of us were being um the wedge between the socially, the social outcasts, poor people, disabled people, was literally growing larger, right? And we were literally disposed of, and so many of the people in our communities died. But then there was people who were fronting rest to the point that they commodified the politic around rest and even our ways of resting, especially for poor Black African women. So much of what we used to do as resting was commodified, repackaged, and sold to a point that we even couldn't afford that. And it also came with shrinking liminal spaces, like Swasima has said. These days, it's so rare for you to go in a village where you can see football pitches or like basically activities that people used to do for rest, right? Just to slow down, to slow themselves down. These days, they're shrinking at a very high rate. So for me, it is a very contentious topic, especially if we delink it and divorce it from the politics and the economy and everything. I There is a point where I reached and I did not want to hear people say things like rest is resistance, because I felt like people were using it as an excuse to not participate you know in our collective liberation, to just opt out of stuff because they are fatigued, they are tired, while the rest of us have to live with nursing this. Personally, I am fatigued. I remember even during lockdown, I shut down. Like my body shut down and I couldn't take it anymore. However, I did not still have the luxury to rest. I had to come back. And I feel like these days I just live with the fatigue. It's like my baby. I have to nurse it from time to time, from time to time. I cannot even rest because the consequences will be there for me. So I just want to ask our speakers, like, how do we not speak of rest as something that's uh is like it's abstract, like it's not even connected to what is happening around you. Just have to slow down. Rest, do not take work as but the luxury, I mean, it's luxurious for me to say that let me just leave work and slow down. I have had consequences for that, like a lot of times where I just couldn't take it and I was punished, right? Because I dared to forcefully rest because it is my right. So I just don't like that kind of framework. Sorry for speaking a lot, but it's a contentious, it's like a point of tension for me, especially with my fellow feminists that I organize with, who really do believe that it is resistance, it is, yeah, so that is it.
Thank you so much, Komungaro. And
Zoe, do
I
you want
think
us to answer, or do you want to first go through the questions?
I will first go through the questions and then, yeah. Thank you, Komungaro, for that. I think a lot of us hold those tensions in terms of, how much can we rest without the consequences of that. So thank you for opening us to that. I will hand over to Teto.
Thanks, Ranita. Good afternoon, everyone. really incredible speakers and incredible contributions to the conversation, which is pretty much a life or death conversation, because if we don't rest, we'll die. And it's really that simple. I had an experience, just to share a bit before I go into some of the thoughts that I have and questions. I had an experience where a former employer would create the environment in such a way that rest would be impossible for me. And I remember when I was resigning, casually saying to them that you are attempting to murder me. This is attempted murder. If one cannot put their bones down and switch their mind off for a certain amount of time, then they're simply not prioritized in terms of the living. And I also share the sentiment of the former speaker that it's kind of a push and pull. And I believe that it is in this way because that is basically how capitalism works. And it's something that I think we must never put like the pedal off the gear on. That capitalism, of course, will come and take everything and package it in a way that will benefit capitalism. Mindfulness is a multi-billion rand market. And rest, like we are discussing today, can equally be packaged in the same way. So I think that we can truly afford to have the conversation around the application of self in the benefit of the community and the majority, especially as people who work in service of the public or in pursuit of a certain philosophical ideology, that we can hold both balances on the scale. I think we can prioritize rest and prioritize work. I do believe that, though, the other issues that I raised around how then some people decide they're not going to work and contribute to the movement because now they're now prioritizing rest. I think those, if anything, are issues that are tied to even the willingness or even the pairing of the purpose and the location where that person finds themselves. Because again, because capitalism, people are in jobs in a lot of these spaces that are no longer unique to the activist. It's a job. We walk in and we want to pour our hearts and our minds, and we're in pursuit of this and that we really believe in. But for someone else, it's really just a job. The same way that they need to apply whatever it is that they do in those spaces to make a living. I'll pause there. Thanks, colleagues and comrades.
Thanks, Teto, for that. And I think as feminists, we are always holding tensions and trying to balance the scales, like you have mentioned. I'll give it to Caroline lastly, and then hand it back to the speakers.
Thank you, Najiko. I hope you are getting me. Okay, thank you. I think that for me, the question will mostly be like, how can we make rest for feminist activists affordable? Because I'm working in a grassroots organization in Cameroon, and firstly, I'm Francophone. So as Francophone first, we don't even get to understand first the importance of rest, because yes, for me rest is resistance. But for now, I think that, and I when I heard the previous person who talked, they said something. Rest is mostly like luxury thing for rich feminists. Let me put it that way. Now, the way I see it, but how can we together make sure that now rest is affordable for each feminist, in regard of where they are, even if they are in institution, even if they are in grassroots organization like me, because we need to rest. Actually, it's been 5 years that I didn't take like a full break, a full holidays. I'm working, and sometimes I even working on weekend, because I'm actually following GBV cases for refugees, and IDPs. So sometimes I even work on the weekend, the work balance, and also you have the social life that you have to balance with. So for me, the real question now is, how can we make rest affordable for each feminist? Because now for me, the way I see it, resistance is true, but actually rest is really it's like luxury for rich feminists. So that's the only thing that I wanted to say. And thank you for this insightful conversation. I'm very happy to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And I think a lot of what you have shared resonates with us as activists, because our work does not really end in a 9 to 5 setting. And I think a lot of our work, even as if we appreciate the gender dynamics of work and labor, our work does not fit neatly within, what people call formal employment. And we carry this work in our bodies. We carry this work back into our lives and our intimate spaces, like a lot of the speakers have tried to bring out. There are some questions in the chat for the speakers, if you can look at those, but I'll hand over back to you. We'll have Dr. Toyin, Twasima, and Selam, and you can, as you're reflecting on what has been shared, you can also share with us some closing reflections that you'd like us to part with. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for participating and contributing to this conversation. I've really learned a lot from Twasima and Selam. I've been taking notes. And I know I don't have enough time to unpack some of the things that I've learned from them today, but it's going to sit with me as part of my own continuous practice. I believe we're in a place of safe, brave, and courageous conversation. And for me, I think even if I don't answer all the questions, given the fact that Selam or Twasima can still talk to them, I really want us to talk about rest. My people, rest is not luxury. My people, rest is not something to earn. Rest is what your nervous system needs. Talk about rest as the way we sleep. But I am not going to take away what has been said, I think by Juanita as well, around the contradictions that they sit with. That I'm not going to take for granted, because language matters. And the way people co-opt things matters. Because when we are talking about co-option, can I give you a few examples? Mental health has been co-opted. Now people are weaponizing mental health. But mental health issues and illnesses happen to us as humans. But if you focus on the co-option, it takes away the importance of mental and emotional well-being, which has even been something that has been taken away from collective and overall awareness of a human, of your holistic self. Yeah? And then let's even talk about self-care. I had a master class recently where I was talking about self-care. Self-care has been co-opted as well for luxury. You go to the spa, you have to, show how much you earn by, the best spa in the world that you can go for. But that's not what self-care is about. When you look at it deep within you, what's it talking about? Yeah? What is the need that your well-being, that your life needs that's not been fulfilled? Then when we talk about resilience as well, is another thing. Emotional resilience, for example, has been co-opted to be endurance, endless suffering, who can go tougher. But what I'm understanding from some of this conversation, we will need to go biological and use neuroscience framework and trauma-informed approach to kind of package some of these things. And that will sit within the healing justice framework, where we are all human beings. We need to do life together and we need to heal together. The part of ordering ourselves, like Twasima had mentioned, is part of where we are getting so disconnected and getting a language that have been programmed from the system that many of us have spoken about to dismantle as the way we are seeing life. Why do I want to unpack that? And I'm sorry that many of us might be sitting on trauma, might be sitting on things that have affected us so deeply, that have colored the way we understand certain things, but we've not looked at. But that's part of why we're here. When we are resisting the need to rest because we think it's for rich people or rich feminists, it means we are denying our nervous system the need to heal, because we are looking at it from the perspective of what have been said. Perhaps we need a new language. Perhaps how we understand rest in our own language is different. Yeah? But your nervous system knows. And the way your nervous system knows when you are not doing it is dropping dead. You know that thing of she's not sick, she just died. We spoke to her yesterday because the nervous system is telling you, take a break. I am tired. I am tired, but you keep pushing them. We push it to the point where that happened. And some of us, we just don't die. The burnout seeped into the system until stroke happened, until cancer happened, until all of these things I call psychosomatic illnesses begin to sit on the body. And then all the other people that we've cared for all our lives might not even remember we exist, even on our dying bed. Because the need to care for ourselves as we care for others is non-negotiable for that fact that our nervous system knows, that the body keeps the struggle, the burnout. So if we are struggling with how it has been given to us, we need to remember the system that is benefiting. And some of you have spoken to that as well. What system is benefiting? What inheritance are we sitting on? This will make me touch on touchy subject that many people don't want to talk about. We need to look at how religion as well are being used to take us to where we are today. And I will give example of Christianity for us to begin to rethink certain things, like Tuasima has said. Christianity, go back to what labor was in Genesis. It was a curse. It was a punishment. It was because God was disobeyed. So you are here never to rest, but to keep on paying the price. Even when they say Christ now came in the New Testament, we are still having the same problem. Yeah? And when you leave that, recently I had a podcast that somebody sent to me where young Christians, cis hetero women in Nigeria, they might be Gen Zs, and I am not judging, I'm just saying, you know, the generation category. They sat pontificating that Bible is the only place that women ever learned. Women were disorderly. They were disorderly. And then Paul told them to learn through the Bible to bring order to humanity. When you look at that, it had ordered everything in our indigenous system. Bible is only 3,000 years old. We've existed more than 300,000 years, you know. And Bible came and met spiritual system that were in tandem with nature, with life. But all of that had been disrupted. So what I want to say is we need to look at everything, and I'm going to wrap up now, within the context of what I will call critical consciousness. Critical consciousness will help you see the socio-political order and the contradictions within that system and how it's affecting us, how we may be contributing to it, how we may be enabling it, and how it may be affecting us because of the people who are privileging from our suffering. Because saying we are not going to rest is allow suffering to erode our well-being. Saying that mental health is not important is not catering to our needs. And saying that is for rich people is bringing into our own heart, body, and mind on wellness. And that's what Healing Justice Framework is calling us to do. But not as a personal thing, but a well-being, a collective thing, where we need to have conversations, you know, to deconstruct certain things that have been given to us, co-opted, or languages that might not be in our culture that we are using. I'm guilty of that as well, because sometimes I want to say certain things to people in my language, I don't know it. Because I went to school early. Every thought in my head is in English. That is an invasion of my being in itself, of my identity in itself. And we have all of these things that have been programmed to us, how we feel shame, how we feel we blame ourselves, how we think we need to deserve things that are just basic needs of what our mind, body, and heart needs. Let me give you an example, and I'm going to give the ground now, the floor. I have 2 cats. Yeah, I'm a cat parent or parent. My cats will not take permission from me to sleep. When they sleep, they are in deep sleep. And when they are in deep sleep and they wake up and they become so energized to do things. And then one of them, Gypsy, who is the youngest, is very energetic. We run around, drag me into running with her. Me, I'm panting. She is panting. Then she goes back to rest while I'm working. By the time she's rested, I will see her in deep sleep. She wakes up again, her body is healed again. She is ongoing with whatever else she wants to do. This is even from the perspective of having an animal in my space. Does the animal think luxury has to be earned? I mean, rest has to be earned as luxury? No. Sleep? No. It's part of what we need to do, but we are trapped in a system. And that system is the matrix. And we're within this matrix that is taken from us, that is hurting us, that is making us see what is important and as our need as now luxury. So I want us to begin to dismantle all of that through critical consciousness, as please, if we can, get healing justice framework and look at it to see how some of these things are unpacked for us to be good to ourselves and to be able to show up in the way that is embodied within our well-being, that is not negotiable for anybody. So I'm sending all of you lots of love and hugs. I know there is no ground for me to talk about the inner work I have to do to take my life back when diseases was unraveling my body, when all emotional hijacking due to complex trauma that I've not resolved was showing up. I realized as at that time that it was not luxury. It's a needed necessity for myself. And I hope in our own journey through life as well, we figured this out within a community that is supportive, that will honor us, and that will let us do what we need to do to heal ourselves.
Thank you, Dr. Twain. Over to you, Twasima.
Where to start? Okay, so it seems to me, Joey and Nawi, that you have the laborious task of communing us several times again, because it's impossible to have these conversations in, 4 sittings. And we must be okay with not having the answers, because there are no neat answers. We're not going to come to this collective future right now, maybe not even in our lifetimes, because it has not taken just our lifetimes for us to be here. This is an unraveling that is generational. It is generational in the sense that we know that our ancestors began this struggle, that we have inherited it, and that we do what we can and pass on to those who come after us. That is the work. That is what it means to exist as an African person who is tethered in Ubuntu, who knows that we are here, we have not made ourselves, and that we are custodians of those who come after us. So doing that, it removes us from the need to know everything all at once. It allows us to sit in the very liminal space and the uncomfortabilities that are valid, that come up as a result. Of course, it is hard to rest because capitalism necessitates us to be in this constant move. Capitalism, the world, the modern world, which is not ours, but was violently dictated unto us, needs for us to be in this constant state of survival. Of course, it is also true that our nation states have failed us because they too are violent imaginations of colonialists. So when we talk about returning to that which is indigenous to us, when we talk about Ubuntu as an African jurisprudence that demands for restorative justice in the sense of reparations, and therefore collapses the material world as we know it. It means that we're acknowledging that the world as it's currently structured today does not allow for us to be whole, to be human, to be able to sit still, to enjoy nature. And so we must then demand for the world as we know it to completely cease to exist and something else come. Because guess what? Something else existed before. And it was not always perfect. But it was not this. Which means that even the future which is yet to come, which we are tasked with the responsibility of co-creating, will be imperfect and will be continually shaped by us and the actions that we take. So, where are these already happening? When I think back to COVID, it is true that so much violence was enacted, and we cannot escape that. But it is also true that so much goodness was found, and perhaps that is what we build onto. It is true that people came together and gave money. I know in Uganda's case, yes, that money was stolen, but communities gathered, people gave food, there were so many actions of goodness that show us that another way is in fact possible. And that we are in fact capable of rethinking how life can be. It will not be linear. It will not be easy because we are constantly fighting against things that seek to dismember us, that seek to disunite us, that seek to keep us in constant, violent, repetitive cycles. But we must constantly search for where our humanity is on full display and build onto that. So it is not true that the future has already been predestined, as they would like us to believe, and they need us to believe this. They need us to believe that the future has already been decided, the same way they need us to believe that the past is what they say it is. There are no linear ways we get to the other side. There are really none. I don't have, I wish I could, if I had a little one-liner to say this is how we do it, I would share it, but I do not because it doesn't exist. This is the work that we must do. This is the work of reimagining. This is the work of building. This is the work of being in movement. It is laborious. It requires conflict. It is endless. But this is the work we must do if we do not want to inherit this that already exists. Okay, thank you all. Over to you now, Selam.
Thank you so much. I think the first thing I want to say is a point of gratitude for the reminder about rest, because I mean, as much as sometimes there is the political commitment to it, and then there's the other to practice it, and the latter is relatively difficult to myself, as I imagine it could be for others. Maybe one additional point that I have is just as much as we rely on these systems, whether it's employment, whether it's being part of certain institutions, school, whatever, just as much as we depend on these systems to keep us afloat, quote unquote, those systems also rely on our collective kind of agreement to the status quo. So if we refuse, then they can't sustain. So I think that remembrance is important for us to think that if we cease to work, this production and productivity won't continue. And then the second thing is in recognizing that we now understand that we have some agency in certain spaces, right? So it's helpful to think of what is possible within the quote unquote constraints, and which constraints are real or like material or immalleable, and which constraints are ones that are just taught. So essentially, what are kind of the barriers that are actually going to constrain our, so that could be kind of responsibilities for caretaking for a child, or like things that are, intrinsic to our lives that we cannot necessarily shift as much. And there are others which are, I need to be seen as a good worker, or I must participate in workforces that are considered kind of worthy of mentioning on my resume, which are kind of taught constraints, which aren't necessarily immovable. So maybe reminding ourselves that some of the constraints are ones that we subject ourselves through because we've been socialized to do so. And then the third and final one, perhaps, is when we are able to set the norms and status quo, then we extend kind of care and space for others to rest, to have healthy relationships with their work and workplaces, and for that to not interfere into their interpersonal livelihoods and the roles they play in community. So when we're in positions where we can make decisions, where we are in a space where we have agency and we can demand for more, to remember to do that not only for ourselves, but for those around us. Because it just needs to be a constant reminder that because we were subjected to it in order to reach certain places does not mean that others also have to kind of bear that brunt. So when younger folks are coming into those spaces, when newer folks are coming into those spaces, extending that kindness and solidarity. So I'll just leave it there and pass it back to you, Joey.
Wow. Yeah, like Twasima said, I guess the task is to create more spaces for these conversations. And as we come to the end of today's session, I really want to thank our speakers for holding such a thoughtful and generous conversation with us. Thank you for helping us navigate some complex discussions. And I think the session has really asked us to sit with difficult but necessary questions through all the reflections that we have had and the feedback. And I hope that we, in our different corners of the world, we continue with the world building that we do every day. And thank you to everyone who joined us today, who shared reflections. I see a lot of conversation in the chat, and I'll pick that and see what needs follow up, and we'll be able to follow up on that. And this session brings our series to a close. And we hope that these conversations will continue in our organizing spaces, in our communities, and in our movements. Thank you again for being with us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much, everyone. Go well. Take care of yourself. Drink water. Take care of yourself. Rest today. I'm looking for another word to use for it, but I don't know. Take care. Bye.